The mountains of North Carolina have a way of feeling both majestic and deeply unsettling once the sun goes down. I have spent most of my life hiking and hunting in these woods, but there is one specific area near Blackwood Creek that most locals avoid after dark. My friends Kyle and Connor and I didn't believe in the old stories. We were in our mid-20s, experienced outdoorsmen, and we figured that 3 men with rifles had nothing to fear from local legends. In October of 2022, we planned a 3-day hunting trip deep into the rugged terrain, miles away from the nearest paved road or cell phone signal. We reached our campsite late Friday afternoon. It was a beautiful spot, nestled between 2 steep ridges with the creek rushing nearby, providing a constant hum of white noise. We spent the evening setting up our tents and building a large stone fire pit. The first night was peaceful. We sat around the fire, eating and talking about our plans for the next day. But the atmosphere changed on Saturday evening. A thick, heavy fog began to roll down from the ridges, settling into the valley like a cold, wet blanket. It was so dense that our headlamps could barely penetrate more than 10 feet in front of us. Around 11:00 p.m., as the fire began to die down to glowing embers, we heard a sound that didn't belong in the wilderness. It was a woman's voice coming from somewhere up the ridge. She wasn't talking, she was screaming. It wasn't the screech of a bobcat or the cry of a mountain lion, sounds we were all very familiar with. This was a human scream filled with pure, unadulterated terror. She was crying out for help, her voice cracking with exhaustion. We all stood up instantly, grabbing our flashlights and scanning the tree line, but the fog swallowed the light. "Did you hear that?" Kyle whispered, his hand hovering over his sidearm. We all nodded in silence, our breath visible in the freezing air. The screams continued, coming in rhythmic intervals. "Help me, please, somebody help me," the voice wailed. It sounded like she was moving along the ridge, perhaps a few hundred yards away. Connor wanted to go after her immediately, but the terrain was treacherous, full of hidden drop-offs and jagged rocks. In that level of fog, running into the woods was a suicide mission. We shouted back, telling her to head toward our light, but she never acknowledged us. She just kept screaming the same words over and over. As we stood there trying to pinpoint her location, the temperature seemed to drop even further. Then the screaming stopped abruptly. It didn't fade away, it just cut off mid-sentence, leaving the woods in a silence so heavy it made my ears ring. We waited for nearly an hour, shouting into the darkness, but there was no response. The only sound was the rushing water of the creek. We decided to stay awake in shifts, but none of us really slept. Every time a branch snapped or the wind shifted, we were back on our feet, staring into the gray void of the fog, wondering who or what was out there. The next morning, the sun struggled to break through the lingering haze, leaving the woods in a dim, sickly light. Despite the lack of sleep, we were determined to find out what had happened. We decided to hike up the ridge toward the area where the screams had originated. We moved cautiously, rifles at the ready, scanning every thicket and rock formation. The ground was steep and covered in slick pine needles, making the ascent difficult. As we reached the crest of the ridge, we found the first sign that someone had actually been there. Caught on a low-hanging briar bush was a long strand of black hair and a small piece of delicate white fabric. Fabric was thin, almost like the material of a summer dress or a nightgown, completely impractical for the rugged terrain and the freezing October temperatures. There were no footprints nearby, which was baffling given how soft the earth was from the previous night's fog. We pushed further along the ridge, following a narrow deer trail. About 50 yards ahead, Kyle stopped dead in his tracks and pointed toward a large, hollowed-out oak tree. Tucked inside the base of the tree was a pair of small, white leather shoes. They were perfectly clean, showing no signs of mud, scuffs, or wear, as if they had just been taken out of a box and placed there. The sight of those pristine shoes in the middle of the wilderness was more terrifying than the screams themselves. It defied all logic. We began calling out again, hoping for a rational explanation, but the only response was the wind whistling through the high pines. The sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. It felt as though hundreds of eyes were peering at us from behind the trunks of the trees. Connor, who was usually the most fearless of us, suggested we head back to camp. He pointed out that if a woman had been out here in a dress and no shoes, she wouldn't have survived the night, and if she had, there would be tracks. We returned to our campsite by mid-afternoon, but the peacefulness of the first night was gone. We spent the remaining daylight hours reinforcing our camp, moving our tents closer to the fire and gathering a massive pile of wood. As dusk approached, the fog returned, even thicker than the night before. It felt intentional, as if the forest was deliberately closing us in. We sat in a tight circle, our backs to the fire, staring into the wall of white mist. Around 10:00 p.m., the sound started again, but it wasn't a scream this time. It was a soft, rhythmic humming, like a mother singing a lullaby to a child. The humming was coming from the edge of the creek, just 30 feet from our tents. I gripped my rifle, my heart hammering against my ribs. I clicked on my high-powered flashlight and swept the beam toward the water. For a split second, the light caught a figure standing on a flat rock in the middle of the stream. It was a woman in a long white dress, her back turned to us. Her hair was long, black and matted, trailing down past her waist. She stopped humming the moment the light hit her. Slowly, she began to turn her head toward us, but before we could see her face, my flashlight flickered and died. We heard a splash in the water, followed by the sound of something heavy running up the opposite bank into the darkness. The rest of the night was spent in a state of high alert panic. We kept the fire roaring so large that the heat was almost unbearable, yet we all felt a deep, unnatural chill. We sat with our backs against each other, rifles across our laps, watching the fog-choked perimeter of the camp. Every time the water splashed against the rocks or a log shifted in the fire, we jumped. The woman didn't reappear that night, and the humming didn't return, but the silence that replaced it was far worse. It felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a move. As soon as the first hint of gray morning light touched the sky, we didn't even wait to eat or pack properly. We shoved our sleeping bags into their sacks, collapsed the tents, and threw everything into our packs with frantic movements. We hiked out of those woods in record time, moving in a tight formation and never stopping to rest. We didn't talk until we were back inside the safety of Kyle's truck with the doors locked and the engine running. The relief of being on a paved road again was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by a lingering, heavy guilt that we couldn't shake. When I got home, I thought I would finally be able to sleep, but the nightmare followed me. That first night back, I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. In the dream, I was back at the creek, but this time I was alone. The fog was so thick I couldn't see my own feet. I heard the screaming again, but it was closer, right behind me. When I turned around, the woman in the white dress was standing inches away. Her face wasn't a face at all. It was just a smooth, pale surface of skin with no eyes, no nose, and a jagged, stitched-up line where a mouth should be. She reached out to touch my throat with fingers that felt like ice, and that's when I woke up. We debated for days whether we should have contacted the local sheriff. Kyle argued that if it were truly a person in danger, they would have responded to our shouts or come toward the fire. Connor believed it was likely a local person or a squatter trying to scare hunters away from their territory. But my mind kept going back to the white shoes and the way the humming stopped the instant the light hit her. There was something about the physics of it, the way she disappeared and the way the fabric was caught so high on the ridge, that didn't point to a living, breathing human being. The three of us still talk about that trip occasionally, but we never went back to Blackwood Creek. We even stopped hunting in that part of the state entirely. What haunts me the most isn't just the visual of the woman on the rock, but the possibility that there really was a person out there who needed us, and we let our fear keep us from helping. Or even worse, the possibility that it wasn't a person at all, and that by picking up the hair and the shoes, we had acknowledged something that was never meant to be found. To this day, whenever I see a thick fog rolling in over the trees, I can still hear that soft, rhythmic humming in the back of my mind.